Hello, everybody. This is the Mercury lecture. Mercury is an element that you all know as maybe used to be used in thermometers. It's this liquid metal at room temperature. It's a really useful thing in certain industrial practices, but what we also see is that it's a really bad poison, and it can really harm people. And where it comes from, the largest source is fossil fuel combustion. And coal by far has the most amount of mercury in it that gets released up into the air. So when you burn fossil fuels, mercury vapor gets released in the air, up into the atmosphere, and then it rains down later with rain, it can just fall out of the air in little droplets too, but not the microscopic droplets. You'd never see it, but most of it will come down with the rain. So the second biggest source then is actually small-scale gold production. So when you watch those silly shows on like the History Channel or National Geographic Channel or something where they're mining gold, what they're doing is digging up the ground, and then a lot of mercury, as they're doing that digging, gets released, because where you often find gold, you often find mercury along with it in those rocks. And then the next biggest thing is cement and production and other types of metal production. Now what we see though is it's just increasing. The amount of mercury that we're releasing has continued to increase, and that kind of just comes along with more fossil fuel use. So if we look at how the mercury is basically raining down on us, what we see is, look at this map up here on the top. From over on the west coast, you basically don't have that much mercury, but then as you go to the east, it increases in how much mercury is basically raining down on the land. Now, why that happens basically is we have a prevailing wind direction from the west to the east, right? So there's a bunch of coal plants. Basically there's all over the United States coal-fired power plants that are releasing mercury vapor. That vapor then gets blown to the east and eventually drops out with rain on the eastern seaboard, basically. But if you look at this map down on the bottom right, what you see is the redder the map is, so the higher on this scale, the more percent of the mercury comes from outside of the U.S. Okay, now basically what that means is for this portion of the entire, half of the U.S. and over, most of that mercury is essentially coming from China and Asian power plants, right? So this is coming from outside the US. Well, there's a big ocean here. It's coming from India, China, other places basically in Asia. And I mean, even over into Wisconsin, we have somewhere between 60 and 75% of the mercury coming from outside the U.S. So this is realistically a global problem. It's not just an American problem. So we know that mercury is raining down, elemental mercury is raining down on the U.S. Now, elemental mercury by itself, yes, is dangerous, but not nearly what it is if it gets turned into methyl mercury. Methyl mercury is extremely toxic, okay? So when it goes into the water, into sediments without oxygen, which is basically the bottom of any lake, the bottom of any stream, bacteria change it to this thing. They take the mercury, the Hg here, they attach a methyl group, meaning 1 carbon and 3 hydrogens. Now, methyl mercury is extremely toxic. It affects the nervous system, memory, language, fine motor skills, all sorts of things. Now, this is particularly bad on developing babies, and it can have a huge lasting impact on human health, on the health of all sorts of different organisms that are exposed to this methyl mercury. The methylmercury is also one of those things that bioaccumulates. So if you look at different, this is an ocean food web where we have basically things that are eating plants, and then as you get basically bigger fish that are eating smaller fish, they're higher on this mercury level. Okay, so the more predatory the fish is, the more mercury it's going to have in it. So things like tuna, swordfish, and shark are going to be extremely high on that mercury levels. But it's not just ocean. This is not just an ocean problem, right? So this is recommendations for what people should be eating, and I particularly would like the women in this class to be thinking about this, because this is extremely important for you if you plan on having children. So, the women and nursing mothers and children under age 15. This is the recommendation for freshwater fish from Wisconsin. You should only have 1 meal per week of bluegill, yellow perch, just the normal fish that a lot of us eat, and only 1 meal per month of walleye, bass, catfish. And women should never eat muskies. Now, there's not that many people that eat muskies, but a decent amount of people eat walleye, right? You can go to Culver's and get walleye relatively easily there. And we in Wisconsin have a pretty big tradition of doing the Friday night fish fry. So it's pretty easy to see how you might be over this level or routinely over this level, depending on how often you're eating these type of freshwater fish. Women beyond childbearing years and men, you can basically have a little bit more. 1 meal per month of muskies, again 1 meal per week of the walleye, pike, and bass, and then basically you can eat as many bluegill as you want, because the methylmercury might get into your body, but it's only going to affect you, and it has less of an effect on adults. So if you look, if you look at the ocean fish, what you see is, I believe this is for women and children, women that are planning to have children. And there is a lot of fish that are actually relatively common that women should just not really ever eat if they're going to plan on having babies. Chilean sea bass grouper is relatively common. Fresh tuna steaks, tuna sushi, swordfish. Not too many people really eat shark, but a lot of people eat fresh tuna steaks. And that's not the canned tuna that we're talking about. Canned tuna is right in here. Some depends on what type of tuna you're talking about, but women that are planning on having children, shouldn't. Snapper is a common fish that you might find, but then they can eat up to 5 servings per week of salmon, shrimp, tilapia. So those are pretty common fish, and those are going to be low on the mercury levels. So it's something really, I think, important for people to be aware of, so that they can make informed decisions, and so they're not essentially poisoning potentially their future children. Now, the whole problem with mercury goes back really several hundred years. You might have heard the phrase "mad as a hatter," and what's that referring to? Mad meaning like crazy. Victorian era hat makers. So in the 1800s, basically, they took beaver pelts, beaver fur, and used mercury to preserve it. And they would be exposed to a bunch of mercury. And over time, the people that worked in these hat factories got exposed to so much mercury that they had neurological problems. They got really shy. They were really irritable. They were really weird people, delirious, suicidal tendencies. And the term "mad as a hatter" probably comes from that term. And the character in Alice in Wonderland is actually based off of a friend of Lewis Carroll's, the author of Alice in Wonderland, who was a hatter and had a lot of these like real crazy characteristics. Um, what we see then is there's the same problems for wildlife. What a insomniac cat or something looks like is weird. We don't really know, but a lot of the same neurological problems can happen in wildlife that we see in humans that are exposed to it. The first time that it really became a problem, I mean, I guess it was a problem for the hatters, but in the early 1900s in Minamata, Japan, there was the Minamata company. I forget what they made, but they used a lot of mercury and dumped it into the bay. And at that time, Japan basically got all of their food and all of their protein sources uh, from the ocean. From in this part in Minamata, Japan, they would just go into their normal bay and get all of their fish products from there. Over 2,200 people were poisoned with mercury. It was a really bad poisoning. This person here was born. His mother had a decent amount of mercury in her body, and he was born, and severe deformity, severe neurological problems. And some of the people that were exposed to it are still alive today, and there's still mercury in Minamata Bay, Japan. That is not going to go away. But the way they actually found out about the mercury poisoning was kind of weird, because the local fish market, basically the fishermen would come in, bring their catches, they would gut their fish and throw the guts basically to a bunch of cats that would be just kind of out in the back behind the fish market. And what they noticed is that all the cats in town were acting really strange. They looked into it and found out that it was eventually mercury poisoning. And later on, then they found that then they saw it happening in people, but they actually discovered it in cats first. So I would say please take some time to go back and look at this list, see what you're commonly eating, and I would occasionally go back and revisit this list so that you're not eating too much fish. That it's hard to eat, of these fishes. It's hard to eat too much of those. I don't know very many people from Wisconsin that eat more than 5 servings a week of fish, but it's definitely something to look at, and that I encourage you to explore a little bit. All right, that's it for this lecture. See y'all later.